What's the real story on tariffs? What is place-based industrial policy? Why are most airports in the U.S. government-owned? I'm Dominic Pino, Thomas L. Rhodes Journalism Fellow with the National Review Institute, and we'll look through those questions on this episode of Econception. Econception is a podcast of the American Institute for Economic Research that looks at the economic issues of the day and broader economic concepts behind them. We're recording today on location from the deadweight loss triangle on the textbook graph about the effects of tariffs. It's extremely dark and gloomy in here, but we believe in pressing on with the podcast to hopefully let some money escape and return to people's wallets where it belongs. Tariffs are one of those economic topics that seem to never go away. We have talked about tariffs since at least the time of Adam Smith in the 1700s, and the idea sticks around. It's been a major player in American political history, and is coming back now because the possibility of a second Trump administration and the promises of some people in and around that administration for a 10% universal tariff on everything coming into the country. And so one top expert on tax issues and on tariffs as well is Erica York. She is the senior economist and research director at Tax Foundation, a think tank based in Washington, D.C. And she's written an excellent piece for the Cato Institute's Globalization Project, which is about tariffs. And the way that I kind of summarize this piece is that with tariffs, there's always a catch. Every time that you think there's some way that you can get ahead from imposing a tariff, there's always some kind of problem. So I have Erica on the show today to sort of run through that and talk about how that's the case. So thanks so much for being here, Erica.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
So I guess, first of all, what is a tariff is a tax on imports. The people who pay the tariff are usually people who are in the country that is imposing the tariff, not the people in the country that the tariff is being imposed on. But you do talk about some situations where the tariff can actually be, the burden of the tariff can actually fall on people in the other country. Can you explain how that is possible?
Yeah, so there's a difference between who's legally obligated to cut the check to the government that's imposing the tariff. That is the person or the business importing the good into that country. But then the economic cost of that can be shifted elsewhere. One way that foreigners can bear some of the cost of a tariff that's imposed by another country is if they lower their prices to still remain somewhat competitive after the tariff. So in that sense, they're bearing at least part of that burden. The way that this is measured is called tariff pass-through rates. So you see how much of the tariff is passed through to prices in the home economy versus how much is borne by foreigners. And pass-through rates can vary. Typically, like in the past in the United States, it's been, somewhere around like 50%. But what we saw in the most recent trade war, 2018, 2019, was pass-through rates of nearly 100% across the steel tariffs, the aluminum tariffs, the tariffs on goods from China. So at least in recent U.S. experience, foreigners haven't borne much of the burden of U.S. imposed tariffs.
And so if we got that pass-through rate down to be really low, right? Let's say it was, 10%, maybe it was 0%. We somehow got the foreigners to pay all of the tariff. Would that be a good argument for opposing a tariff anyway?
It would depend what your goals are. If your goals are to try to increase government revenue, then if prices are falling, you're not raising as much revenue when those prices are lower. So if that's your goal, then you may not be happy with that outcome. If your goal, and this is the goal that we see most often when we're talking about tariffs, is to protect domestic companies by shielding them from lower priced imports, then if that price after tax is the same, you're not accomplishing that goal of shielding domestic producers. So I think it depends on the goal, but there are very few instances where you would see like absolutely zero pass through, especially when we're talking about like an across the board tariff increase. If you thought there was an instance where you could really precisely target the exact right product, the exact right tariff rate, and get the foreign competitor to lower those prices, then maybe, but that's kind of like pie in the sky type economic theory. That's not really how it works, at least in recent U.S. experience.
Yeah, one of the things you mentioned in the article is that exact point that you just referenced there, which is that if you have a tariff and you want it to raise revenue, it's not going to be protective, because a tariff that raises revenue, the only way it can raise revenue is if imports are still coming in. If imports are still coming in, then the domestic producers aren't being benefited by it. And the other flip side of that is that if you have a tariff that is successfully protective, it's not going to raise a lot of revenue because, again, it stops the imports from coming in. And if you're stopping the imports from coming in, you're not taxing anything. So, we hear it sometimes that, oh, this will be great. We can have a tax that is partially borne by foreigners, and then we can use that money to pay down our deficit. Oh, this will be great. But you say it's really an either or proposition.
Yeah, these goals are in tension, and you might get, like some protection and some revenue. You might split the benefit between those. I put benefit in air quotes between those goals. But often when you hear people talk about tariffs, yeah, it's this kind of like magical tax that can raise revenue, protect domestic producers, not cost anything to domestic consumers because foreigners are going to be paying for it. Not all of those things can be all true all at once. You have to grapple with the trade-offs of the policies. And I think that's what's largely missing from the debate, especially when you see like the former President Trump or those in his administration who were in favor of tariffs talking about them. You hear all of these benefits. You don't hear about the tensions and the trade-offs that come along with those.
One of those is the trade-off between imports and exports. You mentioned in the paper that obviously if you tax imports, you're going to get less imports. So that's going to happen. And so people will look at that and they will say, oh, well, a tariff will then lower the trade deficit. But you make the point in the paper that actually tariffs can lower exports too. How is that possible?
Yeah, so this is one of those ideas that seems super counterintuitive. There's this economic theorem, the Lerner symmetry theorem, called it says tax on imports is equivalent to a tax on exports, which just sounds wacky until you like walk through the rest of the chain of events that happens when you impose a tax on imports. So imports drop. If we're talking about the United States, that means consumers in the United States are buying fewer things from foreigners. So we exchange fewer dollars for foreign currency. That lowers the global supply of US dollars, which pushes up the value of the US dollar. You see currency appreciation after you impose tariffs. That stronger dollar makes it harder for US exporters to sell their goods on the foreign market. So imagine, an ag producer selling sorghum or soybeans abroad. When the dollar is stronger, it makes it harder for them to make those sales because their prices are comparatively higher. So that's how that can function, that tax on imports becoming a tax on exports. And we saw that with the most recent trade war. Another channel through which that can occur is given globalization, given supply chains and how they're structured today in a really integrated economy, a lot of what gets imported is actually inputs for domestic production. So you're buying parts or you're buying capital goods that you then go on to use to produce something that you plan to export. So our importers are also our exporters to a large extent. And by increasing input costs, you also make it harder for our exports to be competitive. And so one paper found that the trade war tariffs in 2018 and 2019 were equivalent to like a 2% tax on all US exports. So there's that trade-off to grapple with.
Mm-hmm. And then sometimes when you net it out with the reduction in imports, the trade deficit might not change at all, might even go up. And so it's not as simple as it might seem. One of the other arguments that people will make in favor of tariffs is to protect U.S. jobs. And there are economic papers that will find that tariffs can protect jobs in the industries that the tariffs are designed to protect. But is the cost of that protection worth it? What are the actual estimates of how much money the rest of the economy has to absorb in order for these jobs to be protected in one part of the economy?
So if you think of tariffs, they kind of, in this context, they act as like a redistribution from consumers who are paying those higher costs to producers who may use that redistribution to, increase just returns to shareholders, to hang on to jobs that would not be economically viable otherwise. And estimates, put that cost of redistribution per job anywhere from like $200,000 to almost $1 million per job. Oftentimes, that cost per job is way higher than even the wages that the person performing that job earns. So that just indicates how much economic loss is there when you're paying, let's say, $800,000 for a job that someone maybe earns $70,000 in. A lot of loss there. Another problem with that, just looking at the jobs protected in the industry that's receiving, tariff protection, is that it's not looking at the downstream effects of that. I think this is easiest to see with the steel industry. You impose steel tariffs, you protect some jobs in the steel producing industry, but you raise the cost of steel for steel consuming industries. So whether that's auto manufacturers, other manufacturers of machinery and equipment, transportation equipment, their input costs get higher, which hurts their profitability, impacts how many jobs they have. And what you often find in these more general analysis that look at the entire effect of a tariff on upstream, downstream industries is that you lose more jobs than you save in the protected industry.
So that redistributive effect, that happens when you have a tariff that protects one industry, like you mentioned, steel, or we've seen tariffs on all sorts of specific industries where lobbyists from those industries, they go to DC and they say, hey, we need protection because our competitors are doing something unfair or some other reason, and then politicians will give that to them. But what the Trump administration, or Trump's advisors are talking about would be a universal tariff, so it wouldn't have that redistributive effect because it wouldn't just be on one industry; it would be on all importing industries. So I guess it would help. Maybe the redistribution might be from exporters to importers. Maybe I'm not really sure, but it would definitely have less susceptibility to special interest capture, right? Or would it?
Maybe. I think the broader you apply the tariff, the more opportunities you create for applying for exclusions or exemptions. So even with a 10% across the board tariff, you would still have cases of those who are well connected probably getting a leg up on exemptions and that sort of a thing. There's less of the single industry relationship with the government effect, but I don't think you would eliminate all the corruption or lobbying associated with it.
Yeah, we saw that with the China tariffs. On a previous episode of Econception, we had Ed Gresser on from Progressive Policy Institute, and he talked about how they got at USTR at the time, they got over 50,000 exemption requests in a span of about a year and a half from the China tariffs, which really goes to show, first of all, that Americans actually pay these taxes, because if they didn't, why would they be so upset about it? But second of all, it shows that when an agency like that is flooded with all of these requests, they have to figure out some way to make determinations on it. About who gets an exemption and who doesn't. And it's really, really hard to actually go into the details on 50,000 different things and see which ones are actually economically viable or not. And so if they had 50,000 requests just for tariffs on one country, just think about how many requests they would have for tariffs on every country. So I guess looking at the political effects of tariffs, if somebody might argue, yeah, like we get it, it's economically inefficient, but government does a lot of stuff that's economically inefficient, and sometimes we have to do it for political reasons, just because there might be some political payoff that is more worthwhile than the losses in economic terms. What would you say to arguments that are along that line? Ones that sort of understand the economic theory, but say it's actually not that important.
I mean, we've got some papers that looked at this exact question from the 2018-2019 trade war, and what you describe is exactly what they found. Like, these papers demonstrate overall losses in manufacturing employment, but even in like the jurisdictions that have those manufacturing employment losses, surveys show like political favorability. Like the the Trump administration scored political points for this because of the perception that, oh, this is worth it. The perception that, yeah, we're finally going to beat China on trade, whatever that means, now that we've got this policy in place. So I think, I mean, it goes to like a bigger picture, like educational need for what are the actual costs of this for the American people? How are they experienced? How does that differ from all of this political rhetoric we're inundated with when it comes to tariffs and, the idea that, yeah, China pays that. We're not really affected by this. This is a good thing. So I think it's more of an educational gap and a messaging gap that needs to be overcome so that people do understand the implications of these policies.
Yeah, I feel like it used to be that the U.S. Sort of had a policy of trying to increase free trade with other countries, between NAFTA, but not just NAFTA. There was a series of other trade agreements that came after NAFTA that are much less notable, but with lots of countries in Central America and South America. And that momentum has really just totally stopped. We had President Reagan used to talk about how it would be great if we had sort of a Western Hemisphere free trade zone with both North and South America. And now it seems like nobody on either side of the aisle will stand up for for free trade or for even this past economic policy momentum that we had in the United States that was going in that direction. What do you think it'll take to sort of get people to think about it that way again? And even in terms of looking at U.S. national interest, especially with competition with China, and saying, "Hey, wouldn't it be great if we had a stronger economic bloc of countries that aren't China, countries that will work together and promote free trade and free markets with each other?"
Yeah, so this is something I've been thinking about a lot, and I think with the Trump administration and the first Trump administration and the trade wars that broke out, I think that was a major directional shift in U.S. trade policy and has set us on a path, away from multilateralism and toward unilateralism, away from cooperation and toward protection. We're also seeing this with the rise of industrial policies under the Biden administration and Buy American requirements, and even the maintaining of the trade war tariffs that Trump imposed. So I am afraid we are on a different path now directionally when it comes to trade. And the question is, yeah, what comes next? I absolutely agree. Like if one of our top concerns is this strategic competition with China, it doesn't make sense to take a go it alone approach. It doesn't make sense to start a new trade war with Europe. It would make a lot more sense to find the biggest yard we can of people to cooperate with, of countries to cooperate with, to tackle these challenges that we face, rather than turning inward, putting up more and more barriers to trade. Because we do have this long experience of reducing barriers to trade and seeing the benefits that creates for the American people. So I think it's I'd have a bit of a pessimistic outlook, I'd say, over the near term. But I hope that as we experience the negative consequences of these, subsidies races and these increased barriers to trade, that somebody will rise up to the occasion and, help put a stop to it.
Same. Thanks so much for talking to us today, Erica. This was great. And be sure to read Erica's paper for Cato Institute about tariffs and about these political and economic problems with them. You'll often hear about economic development projects or programs that are targeted to specific geographic areas. The impulse behind this isn't crazy. It's obviously true that in a country as big as the United States, economic trends will affect different parts of the country differently, and there might be some need to rectify the situation with policy. But when we look at how these programs often end up working out in practice, we find that it's not really about rectifying those economic differences. It actually probably has a little bit more to do with politics. Matt Darling of the Niskanen Center looks at some of the recent efforts by the Biden administration to do place-based industrial policy. The idea of place-based industrial policy says there are certain areas of the country that need it more than others, and so we should target federal interventions to those specific areas. The Biden administration has been doing this with things called workforce hubs. Workforce hubs are places that will be the target of more investments from the government, especially related to the technology sector. They're going to use money from things like the American Rescue Plan Act, the infrastructure law that was passed on a bipartisan basis in 2021, and the CHIPS Act. How those laws worked, for the most part, was it was Congress allocating a bunch of money and then leaving it up to the executive branch to decide exactly where that money would go through a process of applying for grants. So you apply for a grant with the Department of Commerce or the Department of Transportation, and then those departments get to decide where the money actually goes. And so the administration has a decent amount of discretion in how it wants to do this, and one of the ways it's been doing that is through what it's calling workforce hubs. Now, there are 8 workforce hubs in the U.S. that the Biden administration has announced. Here they are: upstate New York, Michigan, Milwaukee, Philadelphia, Columbus, Baltimore, Pittsburgh, Augusta, Georgia, and Phoenix. Now, you might look at that list and you think, wow, those are really different places. Upstate New York is very rural. Philadelphia is one of the largest cities in the U.S. They also, just by a sort of top-line guess, they have very different economic outcomes. Phoenix is known for expanding and attracting lots of residents from other places. Baltimore is a shrinking city. But maybe there's some reason to this. Maybe there's a reason that all of these places have been chosen as workforce hubs. What Matt Darling looks at in his analysis of this is he compares this to other scholarship about place-based industrial policy, about places that would be best suited for industrial policy like that. And what that research shows is that one of the things you should look at is employment. This is reasonable, right? If a place has a relatively low level of employment, and again, this isn't unemployment, which is what we usually talk about. This is the opposite of that. It's employment. If it has low levels of employment, then throwing a bunch of money at it to try to create some new jobs might actually work out okay because there are actually people around to fill those jobs. But if you're in a place that already has very high levels of employment and you throw more money at it to create jobs, it doesn't really matter how much money you throw at it because all of the people who want to work are basically already working. So there's just nobody to fill it with. And so what Darling does is he looks at this at the state level, and he finds that the 3 places with the highest employment elasticity, in other words, the 3 places where there are the most potential workers sitting around that could use jobs, are West Virginia, Kentucky, and Alaska. Now you'll notice none of these workforce hubs are in West Virginia, Kentucky, or Alaska. In fact, the only workforce hub that is in a place that has high employment elasticity, I should say, is Michigan. The other 7 are middle of the pack, and 3 of those are really on the lower half. If we look at some of the other places with high employment elasticity, it's places like Arkansas, Mississippi, New Mexico, Oregon. They don't get any workforce hubs. So what's going on here? Maybe the Biden administration just didn't look at this information. Maybe they're using other completely legitimate economic analysis. But just sort of the first basic thing is this a place in need of more employment? And the answer for a lot of these places is not really. Now let's think about it from a politician's perspective. Aside from upstate New York and Baltimore, all of these places are located in historically swing states: Ohio, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Georgia, and Arizona. This probably has a little bit more to do with where they were located than any kind of economic consideration. The real giveaway on this front is Pennsylvania, because both Pittsburgh and Philadelphia are considered workforce hubs. Let's think about this. We've got a country with 50 states, and there's only 8 workforce hubs. And 2 of them are in Pennsylvania. The only state with more than one. Is that because Pennsylvania is especially economically downtrodden? Is that because Pennsylvania really needs this kind of industrial policy? Or is it probably because Pennsylvania has 20 votes in the Electoral College, and it's one of the most politically competitive states in the US, with a basically even divide between Democrats and Republicans? Whoever wins Pennsylvania this year in November has a much higher chance of becoming president. So, when we hear proposals for place-based industrial policy, let's remember that the people making the decisions about which places get chosen oftentimes don't have very good incentives to pick places that actually need it the most, and are probably looking at political considerations more than they are economic considerations. Because this is what politicians think about how the economy works. They think if they can just use power to put money in the right hands in the right places, then we'll get the results that we want. We see this in conversations about infrastructure as well. Pieces of infrastructure that are owned by the government are viewed as massive assets to the government that are used to generate an economic growth that wouldn't otherwise be there. We've seen this attitude in the US, especially with airports. You might not know this, but the United States is very unusual in the fact that basically all of our major airports are owned by the government. Now, the rest of the world used to be that way, but in 1987, in the United Kingdom, government of Margaret Thatcher privatized the British Airports Authority. They just basically had an IPO for the major airports in the UK. And a bunch of investors bought the stock, and they took it off the government's hands. That wasn't just a one-off. That actually started a trend around the world, especially in Europe and Asia, and also in Latin America, of privatizing airports. Now, obviously, nothing works 100%, and there's been plenty of problems with privatizing airports. But there's a lot of problems with government-run airports, too, and the U.S. should really look at following the lead of some other places on this. Mark Scribner of the Reason Foundation wrote the annual report on aviation privatization. And this is one of the things he looks at is how privatized airports are doing around the world. Now, privatized airports can take many different forms. You can sell total ownership or partial stakes in airports. That's more common in Europe. That's what the Thatcher government did in the UK. In other parts of the world, public-private partnerships are more common. And then airports can mix and match these approaches. They can privatize specific terminals or sell them off to different companies and things like that. Because there are so many privatized airports around the world, and again, the US is a real outlier here. In Europe, 75% of all passenger traffic goes through privatized airports. In Latin America, it's 66%. In Asia, it's 47%. But in the US, it's less than 1%. We only have really 2 passenger airports that are privatized. They're in New Haven, Connecticut, and San Juan, Puerto Rico. But because there's all these other ones all around the world, there's lots of airport companies that specialize in running airports. They're all investor-owned. Investor-owned airport companies are worth almost $40 billion. It's a pretty major industry. Because of that, now, this wasn't true initially in the UK, but now, if you privatize an airport and you open it up to investment from anywhere, you can expect to have multiple bids because there's lots of companies that do this, and they'd be interested in getting in on the action. Some of the world's largest airports are privatized. If you've ever flown to Cancun anytime since 1998, that was a privatized airport, Cancun. But again, the U.S. is the odd one out. Now, one of the reasons that we are, a lot of it has to do with government policy. The European-style sale of government-owned airports, like the UK did, is just not legally allowed in the U.S. Publicly owned airports also have tax advantages because they can issue bonds that are tax exempt. Private organizations can't do that. So if you want to invest in an airport in the US, you're better off investing in public airport bonds because you don't have to pay taxes on it. And the FAA funds airport improvements mostly based on political factors and not on profitability. Every year, the FAA has to be reauthorized by Congress, and it's always a fight over how much money to get. And then the FAA gets to determine, similar to how we were talking about before with the place-based industrial policy, they get to determine through grants and programs and things like that where the money actually goes. So a lot of times that's based on political factors, and a lot of airports complain about being underfunded. Now, the answer from politicians a lot of the time, and we saw this in 2021 with the infrastructure bill, was, well, we should just give them more money. Okay, maybe, but what if we allowed them to raise money on their own? Do you really think that there aren't a bunch of private investors that would love to get in on some of the most valuable airports in the world? That's what the U.S. has. Scribner estimates that the potential market value of 31 major airports in the U.S. is $131 billion. There are private investors all over the planet that would love to get in on that. And because it's been going on for so long, we can see how it worked. For airports, it's clear that privatization can provide the improvements that politicians are looking for. 2022 analysis of hundreds of airports around the world found that after privatizing, airports saw higher passenger volumes, greater number of routes, fewer flight cancellations, and greater net income. And they did all of that with no effect on safety. The FAA would still be the safety regulator for airports, but the airports themselves wouldn't be owned by the government anymore. This is how lots of industries work, and it's totally reasonable. Think of the restaurant industry, for example. Restaurants have to pass basic health and safety inspections from the government, but the restaurants aren't owned by the government. And I think we would all know, I think a lot of us would admit, that we're probably more satisfied with how the restaurant industry runs than we are with how the airline industry runs. And so there's really nothing too radical about privatizing airports, and the U.S. is actually unusual for keeping them government run. We should remove that tax exemption for revenue bonds for public airports. And we should allow that style of ownership sale that the Thatcher government used that kicked off this whole trend. Airports are enterprises that can and should be run profitably, not government projects that require taxpayer money. Now it's time for the paper of the episode. But before that, if you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and leave us a positive review wherever you get your podcast. It helps us to know you enjoy the show, and it makes the show more visible for others to start listening as well. I let Erica pick the paper of the episode from the Finance and Economics Discussion Series of papers from the Federal Reserve by Aaron Flann and Justin Pierce from 2019, Disentangling the Effects of the 2018-2019 Tariffs on a Globally Connected U.S. Manufacturing Sector. Here's Erica to tell you about it.
So the paper is called Disentangling the Effects of the 2018-2019 Tariffs on a Globally Connected U.S. Manufacturing Sector. And it's by two Federal Reserve economists, Aaron Flann and Justin Pierce. And essentially what they do is take a micro view, looking at the U.S. manufacturing sector and the three channels through which the 2018-2019 tariffs could potentially impact manufacturing. And so the first is just this traditional protectionism channel. Imposing tariffs on foreign products provides protection for U.S. manufacturers to increase their profits, their market shares, that sort of thing. So they take that into account. Then they also look at the downstream effects on manufacturers who use those protected products as their inputs for their own manufacturing. And then the third channel that they look at is exposure to foreign retaliation. And so they look at how the positive effects from protection balance with those negative effects from downstream input costs rising, as well as foreign retaliation. And they find that the positive effects are entirely offset by those negative effects. And their conclusion is essentially that this traditional channel through which we think that tariffs are going to help manufacturers actually doesn't play out when you look at the rest of the happenings in the economy. So I think that's a really useful paper for folks to look at and think about as they're thinking about what are the implications of the trade war. Can we use tariffs to successfully boost domestic production and domestic jobs? Or are there more trade-offs? Are there more costs? Like you put it, is there a catch to this? And unfortunately, for proponents of tariffs, for people who want to boost manufacturing by using tariffs, the answer is that there is a catch, and the policies that we've tried even recently are counterproductive.
Disentangling the effects of the 2018-2019 tariffs on a globally connected U.S. manufacturing sector by Flan and Pierce. Read it. That's all for today. Remember, the economy is complicated and nobody has all the answers, but markets work.